The land agent's hand trembled as he unrolled the deed across the scarred oak table. Widow Eliza Brennan stood beside her two sons, Henrik at 16 and Colum at 14, their faces weathered beyond their years from 3 seasons working the Missouri rail camps. The agent's finger traced a boundary that encompassed 80 acres in the Greywood Flats, a stretch of valley floor the locals called cursed, on account of the wind that funneled through the gap each winter with such force it had stripped the paint off the old Methodist church 5 miles distant. The agent cleared his throat and said the previous owner had abandoned the claim after 2 winters, that the cabin still stood, but the well had run dry, and that no man in his right mind would try to winter there without a full crew and a season's worth of stored provisions. Eliza placed her palm flat on the deed and said they would take it. The boys nodded in unison. They had buried their father 18 months prior after a timber crane collapsed at the railhead, and the compensation from the company had amounted to $47 and the return of his personal effects in a burlap sack. The money would not last another winter in the boarding houses, where rent consumed their wages faster than they could earn them. Land meant permanence, meant a place where their labor would compound rather than vanish into the pockets of foremen and landlords. They loaded their belongings into a borrowed wagon the next morning, everything they owned fitting into 4 canvas sacks and a wooden trunk that had belonged to Eliza's mother. The trunk contained her sewing implements, a cast-iron skillet, 3 wool blankets, a tin of salt pork, 2 pounds of cornmeal, and a leather-bound Bible with her family names inscribed on the inner cover in fading ink. The journey took 3 days across terrain that grew progressively more austere, the soil changing from rich bottom land to thin, stony ground covered in sage and brittle grass. They passed a handful of homesteads where smoke rose from stone chimneys and livestock grazed in fenced paddocks, but these grew sparse as they climbed into higher country. When they crested the final ridge and looked down into Greywood Flats, they saw the cabin hunched against the far tree line, like a wounded animal seeking shelter. The structure leaned slightly to the east, its chimney intact, but the roof missing several shakes. A scatter of outbuildings lay collapsed in various stages of decay, their timbers bleached gray by sun and wind. Henrik clicked his tongue, and the mules descended the slope, their hooves finding purchase on the loose scree. They reached the cabin as the sun dropped behind the western peaks, painting the valley in shades of amber and ash. The air carried the sharp bite of altitude and the dry whisper of dead grass moving in concert with the breeze. Eliza stepped down from the wagon and walked to the cabin door, which hung askew on leather hinges dried to the consistency of stone. She pushed it open and stood in the threshold, letting her eyes adjust to the dim interior where dust motes swirled in the last rays of sunlight. Inside the cabin, they found a single room measuring 12 feet by 16, with a fieldstone hearth occupying the north wall and a crude sleeping loft accessible by a ladder of peeled saplings. The floor was packed earth, hard as kiln-fired clay, and the gaps between the logs had been chinked with a mixture of mud and grass that had dried and crumbled away in long sections, leaving rifts through which the evening wind now probed with cold fingers. Henrik climbed into the loft and reported that the roof boards were sound where the shakes remained intact, but that rain had rotted through 2 of the support beams and they would need replacement before snow came. Colum inspected the hearth and found the firebox clear of debris, the flue drawing air cleanly when he held a scrap of cloth near the opening and watched it flutter upward. The damper mechanism had rusted in place, but yielded to persuasion from a length of iron rod they found among the debris outside. They unloaded the wagon by lamplight, stacking their provisions against the east wall and spreading the blankets in the loft where the roof showed no signs of seepage. Eliza heated salt pork and cornmeal in the skillet over a small fire, mixing the meal with water from their canteens to form a thick porridge that they ate with wooden spoons carved by their father during the long evenings in the boarding house. The meal was plain and filling, the salt pork lending a richness to the cornmeal that made it almost luxurious after days of cold biscuits and dried beef. When they finished, Henrik banked the fire and they climbed to the loft, lying shoulder to shoulder under the blankets while the wind moved through the cabin walls with a sound like water over stones. The temperature dropped steadily through the night, and by dawn, a skin of frost covered the inside of the cabin walls, where moisture had condensed and frozen. In the morning, they walked the property line, Henrik pacing off distances while Colum marked boundaries with cairns of stacked stone. The valley ran roughly north to south, bounded by pine-covered ridges on either side, and opening to a broad meadow that would provide grazing if they could acquire livestock. The grass stood knee-high in places, dormant now but thick-rooted and showing the remnants of summer growth. A creek ran along the western edge of the claim, its water clear and cold, flowing over a bed of smooth river rock worn round by centuries of current. Eliza knelt and tasted it, then nodded. The water carried the mineral clarity of snowmelt, free from the silty taint that plagued the lowland streams. They followed the creek upstream to its source, a spring that bubbled from beneath a limestone ledge surrounded by wild mint and watercress. Here the boys began to dig, carving a basin into the soft earth and lining it with flat stones to create a collection pool. By midday, they had fashioned a serviceable well, the water level holding steady at 18 inches depth. They drank deeply and filled their canteens, then returned to the cabin to begin repairs. The work consumed them utterly. Henrik felled 2 straight pines from the ridge and stripped them with a draw knife, shaping replacement beams that he and Colum hauled to the cabin using a system of ropes and leverage that their father had taught them during the rail work. They positioned the beams beneath the damaged sections and jacked them into place using wedges of split oak, then secured them with iron spikes, salvaged from the collapsed outbuildings. Eliza mixed fresh chinking from clay. She dug near the creek bed, adding dried grass and pine needles to bind the mixture, working it into the gaps between logs with a wooden paddle until the walls stood tight and whole. The consistency had to be exact, wet enough to press into the crevices, but dry enough to hold its shape without slumping. She tested each batch by rolling a portion between her palms, judging by texture and moisture content until she achieved the proper balance. They replaced the missing roof shakes with split cedar, overlapping each piece to shed water and securing them with hand-forged nails driven through pre-drilled holes to prevent splitting the wood. The repairs took 6 days of sustained labor from first light until darkness made detailed work impossible. On the 7th day, they walked to Ashford Station, the nearest settlement, a cluster of buildings arranged around a rail depot where freight wagons gathered to transport timber from the mountain mills. The general store occupied a 2-story structure with a false front painted yellow, its windows displaying goods arranged with careful precision. Inside, the proprietor stood behind a counter of polished walnut, his spectacles catching the light from oil lamps suspended on chains from the ceiling. His name was Gideon Marsh, and he wore a vest of gray wool over a white shirt with sleeves rolled to the elbows. Eliza inquired about the cost of supplies for winter, presenting a list she had compiled during the previous evening. Flour, beans, lard, coffee, lamp oil, nails, rope, and 3 laying hens if any could be spared. Marsh calculated the total with a pencil stub, his tongue visible between his teeth as he worked the figures, and named a sum that would consume most of their remaining capital. She agreed, and paid in silver coins that rang against the counter with a sound that seemed to carry finality. Marsh asked where they were settling, and when Eliza named Greywood Flats, his expression shifted to something between pity and amusement. He said the wind would drive them out before Christmas, that no family had lasted a full winter in that valley, and that the cabin would likely collapse under the weight of snow. Eliza thanked him for the information and said they would manage. They loaded the supplies into the wagon and purchased the hens, 3 red birds that clucked anxiously in a wooden crate. On the journey back, Henrik asked his mother if she thought Marsh was right about the wind. Eliza said that wind was simply air in motion, and that air could be redirected or blocked or harnessed, depending on how one approached the problem. The boys considered this in silence. That night, Eliza sat by the fire with a sheet of paper and a piece of charcoal, sketching diagrams while the boys tended the hens in a makeshift coop they had constructed from salvaged lumber. She drew the cabin from above, marking the direction of the prevailing wind with arrows that flowed from northwest to southeast. Then she drew a second structure, positioned to the north and west of the cabin, angled to deflect the wind upward and around the living space. The structure would need to be tall enough to break the wind's force, but permeable enough to prevent pressure from accumulating against its face. She envisioned a wall built from vertical poles set close together, creating a barrier that would slow the wind without blocking it completely. The spacing between poles would be critical, narrow enough to disrupt the wind's coherence, but wide enough to allow air to pass through, rather than building up dangerous force. The boys returned and studied the sketch, their faces illuminated by firelight that cast long shadows across the packed earth floor. Henrik asked what materials they would need. Eliza listed timber for the uprights, crossbeams for stability, and rope to lash the assembly together. Colum asked how tall the structure should be. Eliza said 15 feet would be sufficient to redirect the wind over the cabin roof, based on calculations she had worked out regarding the angle of deflection and the distance to the dwelling. They would build it in sections, raising each panel and anchoring it with guy wires before proceeding to the next. The work would take weeks, but the alternative was to surrender the claim and return to the boarding houses where their money would drain away like water through sand. The boys agreed without hesitation. In the morning, they began felling trees, selecting lodge-pole pines of uniform diameter and cutting them to length with a crosscut saw. They stripped the bark and sharpened one end of each pole to drive into the ground, working with an efficiency born from mutual understanding. Henrik and Colum moved in tandem, one sawing while the other positioned the next log, their rhythm unbroken by conversation. Eliza cooked beans and fried cornmeal cakes on a flat stone she had placed among the coals, the food simple but adequate to fuel their labor. She brought water from the spring in wooden buckets and kept a pot of coffee simmering throughout the day, strong and black and sweetened with a precious spoonful of sugar at noon. By the end of the first week, they had prepared 40 poles and dug a trench running 30 feet from northwest to southeast, positioned 40 yards upwind of the cabin. They set the first poles in the trench, tamping earth around each base until they stood vertical and firm. Then they lashed horizontal crossbeams at intervals of 3 feet, creating a lattice structure that resembled a massive fence. The wind tested their work constantly, pushing against the poles with invisible hands, but the design held. Word of their project reached Ashford Station through a trapper who passed through the valley and reported seeing a widow and 2 boys constructing what he described as a wall to nowhere. The following Sunday, a delegation arrived from town, 4 men on horseback led by Gideon Marsh. They dismounted near the wind wall and stood examining the structure with expressions that ranged from curiosity to outright derision. Marsh called out a greeting and Eliza emerged from the cabin, wiping her hands on her apron. The men introduced themselves as members of the town council and said they had come to see the famous construction project that had become a topic of conversation at the general store and the saloon. One of them, a barrel-chested man named Vernon Hatch, who owned the livery stable, asked what purpose the wall served. Eliza explained the principle of wind deflection, how the barrier would redirect the prevailing winds upward and create a zone of relative calm around the cabin. She gestured to show how the structure would force the wind to rise and pass overhead rather than striking the dwelling directly. Hatch laughed and said that wind could not be stopped by a few sticks in the ground, that they would be lucky if the whole arrangement did not blow down before Thanksgiving. Another man, Cyrus Kemp, who ran the sawmill, said it was a fool's errand to try to tame the Greywood wind, that nature would have its way regardless of human cleverness. He had seen men with better resources and more experience fail at simpler tasks than this. Marsh said nothing, but his silence carried the weight of agreement. The fourth man, whose name Eliza did not catch, simply shook his head and remounted his horse without comment. Eliza thanked them for their visit and said time would tell whether the design succeeded or failed. The delegation mounted their horses and rode back toward Ashford Station, and one of them made a comment about widows and children playing at engineering that carried clearly across the valley floor. Henrik heard it and looked at his mother, but she shook her head and returned to the cabin. The boys resumed their work without discussion. They extended the wind wall to 45 feet in length and added diagonal bracing to resist lateral forces. Eliza calculated the spacing between poles using a length of rope marked at 6-inch intervals, ensuring uniformity across the entire structure. When they finished, the wall stood like a sentinel between the cabin and the northwest gap, its poles weathering to silver gray as autumn deepened into the first whispers of winter. The hens produced eggs with reliable consistency, and they traded a dozen to a passing freight hauler for a small sack of oats and a tin of molasses. Frost came earlier than expected, coating the valley in white crystal that melted by mid-morning, but returned each night with greater tenacity. They gathered firewood obsessively, stacking cord after cord against the cabin's east wall until they had amassed enough to burn continuously for 3 months. Eliza showed the boys how to bank a fire so that coals would hold through the night, conserving fuel while maintaining livable warmth. They insulated the loft with dried grass packed between the roof boards and the ceiling, creating an air gap that would trap heat rising from below. The first true storm arrived in mid-November, announced by a pressure drop that made their ears ache and a sky that turned the color of old iron. The wind came howling through the gap with a force that seemed intent on erasing every human mark from the valley. It struck the wind wall with a roar like falling water, and Eliza stood in the cabin doorway, watching the poles bend and flex but hold their positions. The wind rose up and over the barrier exactly as she had calculated, creating a pocket of relative stillness around the cabin while the full fury of the storm passed overhead. The sound was tremendous, a continuous howl that made conversation impossible, but the cabin itself remained oddly peaceful in its protected zone. Snow came with the wind, driving horizontal across the landscape and accumulating in drifts that reached the cabin's eaves within hours. The temperature dropped to levels that froze exposed skin in minutes and turned breath to ice crystals in the air. Henrik and Colum took turns throughout the night, keeping the fire fed and monitoring the wind wall through gaps in the shutters. By morning, the storm had exhausted itself, and they emerged to find the valley transformed into an unbroken expanse of white that reflected the pale sunlight with blinding intensity. The wind wall stood intact, every pole in its original position. The snow piled in a great drift on the windward side, but the cabin itself protected and clear. They cleared a path to the hen house and found the birds huddled but alive, then walked the length of the wind wall checking for damage. There was none. The lashings had held, the diagonal braces had done their work, and the earth around each pole base remained packed solid despite the force that had tested it. In Ashford Station, the storm had torn roofs from 3 buildings and collapsed the wall of the livery stable, trapping 2 horses that had to be dug out of the rubble. Vernon Hatch suffered a broken arm when a beam fell during the evacuation. The town spent a week digging out and repairing structures, and it was during this work that someone mentioned seeing smoke from the Brennan claim and wondering if the widow and her boys had survived. Gideon Marsh organized a party to ride out to Greywood Flats, expecting to find the cabin destroyed and the family either dead or departed. Instead, they found the Brennans calmly splitting firewood, the cabin intact, and the wind wall standing like a testament to the power of deliberate thought applied to natural forces. Marsh dismounted and walked the length of the structure, running his hand along the poles and examining the lashing work. He asked how it had held. Eliza explained that the permeable design allowed wind to pass through while disrupting its coherent force, that the diagonal bracing distributed lateral loads across the entire assembly, and that the angle of the wall redirected the remaining wind upward rather than letting it pile against a solid barrier. Marsh nodded slowly. Vernon Hatch, his arm in a sling, said nothing, but his expression had lost its earlier mockery. December brought a cold that settled into the valley like a physical presence, turning the air brittle and sharp. The Brennans refined their system with each passing day, learning to read the subtleties of weather in the color of the dawn sky and the behavior of the hens. They discovered that banking the fire in a specific pattern created convection currents that drew warm air down from the loft and circulated it through the cabin, maintaining even temperature throughout the space. Henrik carved shutters that could be adjusted to control airflow without losing heat, using leather hinges that remained flexible in the cold. Colum built a reflector from flattened tin cans that directed heat from the hearth into the room rather than letting it escape up the chimney. These were small innovations, but they accumulated into a system that made winter not just bearable but almost comfortable. The cabin became a study in thermal efficiency, every gap sealed, every surface considered for its role in heat retention or reflection. In town, word spread about the Brennan claim. Families struggling with heating costs and wind damage began asking questions about the wind wall's design. Eliza received visitors most weeks, people who rode out to see the structure for themselves and inquire about the principles behind it. She explained freely, drawing diagrams in the snow with a stick and demonstrating the angle calculations using ropes and wooden stakes. Her explanations were patient and thorough, ensuring that those who wanted to build their own structures understood not just the mechanics, but the reasoning behind each element. Some listeners nodded and thanked her, but did nothing further. Others took notes and returned to town to begin their own construction projects. By Christmas, 3 families in Ashford Station had built smaller versions of the wind wall to protect their homes and barns. The structures worked with varying degrees of success, depending on the quality of construction and the accuracy of the angle calculations, but even the poorest attempts provided measurable improvement over bare exposure to the wind. Cyrus Kemp, the sawmill owner who had mocked the original design, came to the Brennan cabin on Christmas Eve carrying a sack of flour and a small ham wrapped in cloth. He said it was a gift in recognition of good work and an apology for his earlier words. Eliza accepted both and invited him to share their evening meal. They ate beans and cornbread with the ham divided into portions that seemed almost extravagant after months of austere rations. The richness of the meat, after weeks of plain fare, made the meal memorable beyond its actual substance. Kemp asked if they had considered expanding the wind wall to protect a larger area, perhaps enough to shelter livestock or a garden plot. Eliza said they had discussed it and would likely add sections in the spring when the ground thawed enough to dig new post holes. Kemp offered to provide timber from his mill at cost, saying that neighbors who solved problems together prospered together. It was a practical statement delivered without sentiment, but Henrik and Colum recognized it as the closest thing to praise their work would likely receive from that quarter. January arrived with a ferocity that made November's storm seem like a rehearsal. The sky darkened to near black, and the wind came shrieking through the gap with such force that it seemed capable of moving the earth itself. This was the storm the old-timers had warned about, the kind that happened once a decade and left marks on the landscape that endured for years. The Brennans secured everything that could move, double-checked the wind wall's lashings with careful inspection of every knot and anchor point, and retreated to the cabin with enough firewood stacked inside to last 3 days without venturing out. They brought the hens into the loft for added warmth and protection. The storm hit at midnight and raged for 36 hours without pause. Snow fell so thick that visibility dropped to arm's length, and the cold was savage, a penetrating chill that found every weakness in wood and stone. The wind wall held, but the force against it was tremendous, a sustained pressure that made the poles creak and the guy wires sing like musical instruments. Henrik and Colum took shifts watching for structural failure, ready to reinforce any section that showed weakness, but the design proved sound, and the materials held. The diagonal bracing distributed the loads exactly as calculated, and the permeable construction prevented the dangerous pressure buildup that would have torn apart a solid barrier. In Ashford Station, the storm devastated everything in its path. The false front of the general store tore away and sailed through the air like a playing card, smashing through the window of the hotel across the street. 6 buildings lost their roofs entirely, the shingles and boards scattered across the frozen landscape like discarded toys. The livery stable, already weakened from the previous storm, collapsed completely, and Vernon Hatch's remaining horses had to be led through chest-deep snow to shelter in the church. Families huddled together in the most intact structures, burning furniture when their firewood ran out, and when the storm finally passed, they emerged to find their town transformed into a disaster site that would require months to rebuild. 3 people had died from exposure or injury during the evacuation efforts, their bodies recovered only after the snow had settled. The town council met in emergency session in the back room of the hotel and decided to send a party to check on outlying claims, expecting to find abandoned homesteads and possibly more casualties. The riders prepared themselves for grim discoveries. When they reached Greywood Flats, they found the Brennan cabin standing without damage, smoke rising cheerfully from the chimney, and the wind wall intact though covered in a mantle of snow and ice that made it look like a frozen sculpture. Eliza and her sons were outside clearing paths when the delegation arrived. Gideon Marsh dismounted and stood looking at the scene with an expression that mixed disbelief with something approaching reverence. He said that town was in desperate need of shelter and that several families had nowhere to go until repairs could be made. He asked if the Brennans could provide any assistance, though he seemed embarrassed to make the request of people they had previously mocked. Eliza did not hesitate. She said they could accommodate 4 adults in the loft if people were willing to sleep close together, and that the cabin could serve as a warming station for others who needed respite from the harsh cold. Henrik and Colum immediately began organizing, clearing space in the loft and stoking the fire to raise the interior temperature significantly. They moved their belongings to one corner to maximize the available sleeping area and spread extra blankets they had stored for emergencies and unforeseen circumstances. Within an hour, the first group arrived, 2 families whose homes had become uninhabitable. They entered the cabin with expressions of exhausted relief and stood near the hearth, letting the warmth penetrate their frozen clothing. Eliza served hot coffee and cornmeal porridge, apologizing for the plainness of the fare. But the families ate gratefully and said it was the first warm meal they had consumed in 2 days. Their hands shook as they held the tin cups, not from cold alone, but from the accumulated exhaustion of fighting the storm and its aftermath. More people arrived throughout the afternoon, some staying for an hour to warm themselves before returning to town, others remaining for the night. The cabin became crowded but not uncomfortable, the body heat of multiple occupants combining with the hearth's output to create a warmth that felt almost luxurious after the brutality outside. People spoke quietly among themselves, sharing accounts of the storm's destruction and making plans for reconstruction that would occupy them for months. Vernon Hatch arrived near evening, his arm still in its sling, leading a woman and 3 children whose home had been completely destroyed. He thanked Eliza without elaboration, and she simply nodded and made space for the family near the fire. The children were young, the oldest perhaps 7, and they stared at the hens roosting in the loft with wide eyes until their mother gently redirected their attention. Throughout the night, people took turns sleeping while others kept watch on the fire and tended to the needs of children. Henrik and Colum gave up their sleeping space and dozed sitting against the cabin wall, their bodies adapted to discomfort from the rail camp years. By morning, the cabin had become a small community bound by shared hardship and the recognition that survival often depended on the willingness of strangers to become neighbors. Gideon Marsh organized a rotation system, with families spending one night at the Brennan cabin before returning to town to make room for others. This continued for 2 weeks while Ashford Station slowly rebuilt. During this period, the Brennans shared their remaining food stores without complaint, accepting repayment only in the form of labor assistance when offered. Several men helped extend the woodpile and repair minor damage to the outbuildings. When the crisis had passed and the last family had returned to a repaired home, the town council held a meeting to discuss the situation. They voted unanimously to fund the construction of additional wind walls throughout Ashford Station, using the Brennan design as the template. They also commissioned a survey of vulnerable homesteads to determine where similar protection might be needed. Spring came late to Greywood Flats, the snow retreating grudgingly to reveal earth that steamed in the pale sunlight. The Brennans began the work of expansion, adding sections to the wind wall and preparing the protected ground for planting. Henrik and Colum worked with the efficiency of practice, their movements synchronized without need for instruction. They had survived their first winter on the claim, and the land no longer felt foreign, but rather like something they had earned through labor and foresight. The cabin felt permanent now, rooted to the valley floor through more than simple construction. Eliza ordered seeds from the general store catalog, varieties suited to high altitude and short growing seasons. She sketched plans for a larger henhouse and a root cellar that would triple their food storage capacity. The work was constant, but no longer desperate, informed now by confidence rather than fear. Visitors continued to arrive from town, some seeking advice on their own wind walls, others bringing gifts of gratitude for the shelter provided during the crisis. Gideon Marsh came one afternoon with news that the town council had voted to name Eliza as the official consultant for all wind protection projects in the county, a position that carried both modest compensation and formal recognition of her expertise and innovative contributions. she accepted with the same quiet dignity she had shown throughout, neither prideful nor self-deprecating, simply acknowledging the work that needed doing. In May, a photographer arrived from the territorial newspaper, wanting to document the wind wall for an article about frontier innovation and engineering solutions to natural challenges. He set up his camera on a tripod and captured images of the structure with the cabin visible behind it, the composition showing the relationship between protection and dwelling. Then he asked Eliza to stand with her sons for a portrait. They posed awkwardly, unused to such attention, their faces serious and their clothes worn but clean. The photograph would appear in newspapers across 3 territories and prompt inquiries from as far as Wyoming and Utah. People wanted to know about the design, the materials, the costs, the specific angle calculations. Eliza responded to every letter with detailed instructions and encouragement, charging nothing for information she believed should be shared freely. Knowledge hoarded served no one, but knowledge shared multiplied in value. By summer, the valley had transformed. Wild grasses grew thick in the protected zones, and the Brennan's garden produced vegetables that they traded in town for flour and coffee and lamp oil. The hens laid prolifically, and they sold eggs at the general store each Saturday, building a small but steady income that allowed them to purchase tools and materials they could not make themselves. Henrik had grown 2 inches, and his voice had deepened. Colum showed an aptitude for carpentry and spent his evenings carving furniture from salvaged timber. They were no longer refugees from the boarding houses, but homesteaders with a proven claim and the respect of their community. The wind still came through the gap each winter, as it always had and always would, but it no longer held dominion over those who understood its nature and built accordingly.